This is the BioCentury Show.
Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Join BioCentury and Insights partner McKinsey & Company this September in Nashville for an R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia.
Hello, I'm Steve Usdin, BioCentury's Washington editor. Today I'm speaking with John O'Brien, President and CEO of the National Pharmaceutical Council, a think tank funded by the pharmaceutical industry. Dr. O'Brien's worked on policy issues at the intersection of innovation and economics from a number of vantage points. At a pharmaceutical company, at the Drug Industry Trade Association Pharma, as an academic, at CMS, and at Blue Cross Blue Shield, and notably at HHS during the Trump administration, where he led the administration's attempts to reduce drug prices. John, thanks for coming on the show. I want to talk to you today about the IRA, 340B, what drug pricing policy might look like in the next administration, and other kind of like wonky stuff. But I want to start with a big picture question. When you think about drug prices, what does success look like? Can you envision a situation in which there's a consensus on the right and on the left between drug companies and payers that drugs are priced about right? Because I think if you can, or if we can, then maybe it's possible to work backwards from that to come up with policies that work. And if you can't, then, or if we can't, then it seems like the finger pointing, the recriminations are going to be never ending.
Well, that's a really important question, and a big reason why I'm here at NPC. We're a 70-year-old health policy research organization that conducts important health policy research and communicates it with impact. And I'm really lucky to work with some experienced and smart researchers that care a lot about patient access. And this question kind of brings me back to how I came here and why I think this is my dream job. As a kid, I wanted to be a sports broadcaster. I was fascinated by the medicines that made a difference in my mom's health and my family's life, and that's what led me to pharmacy school. And I'm a pharmacist by training, and I spend a lot of time thinking about the perspective that patient has at a pharmacy counter when they're just simply trying to fill a prescription. So to me, the answer really begins there, which is drug pricing for most people refers to the price that they're being asked to pay at the pharmacy counter. And if you've ever tried to help someone with a chronic condition or accessing a medicine, you become really interested in patient access, and you understand the importance of policy and how the healthcare marketplace works. And that's ultimately what took me to what you mentioned, which was working for a large health plan, working for the industry, being in academia, and ultimately in the last two administrations. Look, I think all of these experiences have taught me that prescription drugs help people get well, stay healthy, and avoid more costly care settings. And one of the biggest trends that we're watching here at NPC is how our current system to pay for medicines isn't working for everyone. So when I think of the policy, I really think about what are the best ways to lower prices for patients at the pharmacy counter and recognize that the value medicines have in helping people get well, stay healthy, and avoid more costly care settings.
But it's not all just about out-of-pocket costs. You've been on the other side. You've been at insurance companies, for example. You've been at CMS, and you can see that. And you can't just say, well, if you could just lower the out-of-pocket costs, all the other problems would magically go away, because the health, somebody's ultimately going to be paying for these things, and there are going to be issues around pricing, even if you solve the out-of-pocket costs. Maybe the political dynamics would change that.
Yeah, I'd really start with a wish that policymakers from all sides of the aisle learn more about what it takes to really bring a drug to patients, and to better understand that a huge chunk of what we call drug prices or drug spending is actually going to someone that doesn't make the medicine. So when I think back and the numbers that I used to pull out of CMS or work with at ASPE to create, I think it's really important to remember that about 55 cents of every dollar is actually going to someone who doesn't make the medicine. So out-of-pocket costs are important to me because that's what the patient pays. But we can take that conversation up a notch and ask the question about employers' concerns that what they're being told that they're paying may not actually be the price that the person who's working on their behalf is paying, and that they may not be getting all the discounts that are intended for them, or that they've become so reliant on rebate guarantees, large, payments made at the end of the year that they use to lower premiums for everybody, that may not be helping the person at the pharmacy counter that needs access to that medicine.
Yeah, so I was going to go there a little bit later in the conversation, but let's go there now. PBMs, right? The FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, put out a staff report today. Surprise, surprise! They find out that PBMs, affect what people pay for drugs. They determine whether people have access to drugs. It's a highly concentrated market. It's vertically integrated with the pharmacy companies and the insurance companies. What to do about it?
You're a real fast reader. It's hard to believe that it's been about 2 years, I guess, since we submitted a comment letter to the FTC when they requested public comments on PBM business practices. I saw a lot of our concerns in today's report. Words like highly concentrated, vertically integrated, enormous power over patient access and affordability, the power to inflate drug costs, and things like unfair and arbitrary and harmful disadvantaging of pharmacy. So we're going to continue to do research about some of those concerns, especially the concerns around vertical integration, consolidation of market share, the use of offshore GPOs, and the charging of fees from all parts of the supply chain that seemingly function to take money from the left pocket and put it in the right pocket. Because I think as long as PBMs and health plans prefer high WAC, high rebate medicines, patients are going to bear the cost of that, whether they're paying their coinsurance or whether they're still in their drug deductible at in a HSA eligible high deductible health plan.
So one of the things that's been proposed, and it was proposed during the Trump administration when you were there, is it was proposed and then it was taken off the table and then it was put back on the table, but it never happened, is passing the rebates that drug companies give to PBMs back to the patients at the pharmacy counter. Do you think that's a viable policy? And two, do you think it's something, if President Trump were to be reelected, that you could expect his administration to pursue?
It's hard to know what any next administration is going to do. And, my understanding was it was finalized during the Trump administration, and part of the Inflation Reduction Act was sort of delaying its implementation for a few more years. I would absolutely like to see a focus on policies that address the use of rebates so that patients are actually paying less at the pharmacy counter, as opposed to using these discounts that are meant for patients to subsidize other parts of the healthcare system. I think, ironically, you mentioned the IRA at the top of this call. I think the way that the IRA and rebates and some of the other perverse incentives that exist in plans today are going to lead to some real unintended consequences in terms of how patients actually benefit from what's being implemented around them.
So let's go there. Let's go to the IRA and unintended consequences. You've written and spoken about unintended consequences in the IRA. What are your concerns, and what are you going to be looking for when we see the first prices come out, and probably around September 1st?
Yeah, I appreciate the intent of Part D redesign, especially capping patients' high out-of-pocket costs. And yet, I'm really concerned about the potential unintended consequences of the price-setting provisions of the law, especially as it relates to the clock that gets used to select drugs for eligibility.
9 years for small molecules, 13 years for biologics.
Yep. And you saw our research, first in Health Affairs Forefront and then ultimately in the American Journal of Managed Care and in countless poster sessions across the country that shows that the way that price setting provision works may result in delayed launches, fewer subsequent indications, and less post-approval research on long-term outcome studies, the kinds of things that clinicians and guideline developers really rely on. But if we set aside the unintended consequences on drug development, this law is being dropped into a system that isn't working that well for patients. So it's unclear to me how the IRA's price setting and Part D redesign changes will impact patient access. And I think that's something that we should really be focusing on. Plans bear 4 times the risk in the catastrophic phase than they did before.
Let's just stop there just a second, because I think people who are listening and watching may not understand what you're talking about there. Can you explain that just one sentence or two sentences?
Yeah, so it used to be as you made your way through the Part D benefit and you began to have higher drug costs, the Part D plan would bear a small part of that, right? About 15% of the overall spending. And the patient would have to bear 5% of that, right? So no matter how much they spent on their medicines, no matter how high their drug costs were, they were always going to be on the hook for 5% of that. So
no cap, yeah.
So the Part D redesign said, nope, let's cap that at $2,000. But it also said that the portion of that spending that the plans are accountable for is going to go up from 15% to 60%. Now, you can say, like, hey, that's good because that's going to function more like insurance, and that's going to encourage plans to want to think differently about spending. But I'm not entirely sure that it's going to play out in a good way. Because not only are Part D plans now responsible for more risk on the top, these drugs that get selected for the drug price negotiation program and then have a price set by the government, some of these drugs are in really competitive classes and they're paying really high rebates. Those rebates now go away, because the plan has to, or the manufacturer has to make that drug available at the pharmacy through some effectuation process that we still don't have a lot of detail.
And cutting kind of to the punchline, the plans then have an incentive to prevent people from using those drugs, and they're going to create incentives to use drugs where they're still getting big rebates, regardless of what's best for the patient.
Yeah, that's not all. I think that the financial incentive to do utilization management is higher than it's ever before. And I am really looking downfield to see what those formularies look like, because I really think that this could lead plans to increase utilization management and put more barriers to these 10 drugs, including putting them on tiers with higher copays. And CMS so far has been very lukewarm on whether or not they're going to do something about that. We're also seeing research that suggests that some patients' out-of-pocket costs may actually go up. So higher premiums, potentially less access, higher out-of-pocket costs. I'm not sure that's the program that people are really looking for.
And do you think that, say again, say Trump is in office, and you have a different CMS in the next administration, do you think that they're going to continue on the same path that this CMS has, or will they change course on the IRA?
Again, it's really hard to know what a second Trump term will bring. I think the Beltway chatter seems to be that he'd undercut the IRA and maybe even try to bring back some of the most favored nation proposals. But the bottom line is that regardless of who wins, we're living in a policy environment that's impacted by misguided political hostility towards an industry that makes life-saving medicines. And what's good in politics is often not good policy.
Well, that's a good point to take a break. And we'll come back and see if we can talk about a little bit more on some of the policies that you think are misguided, and then hopefully some solutions, some things that might bring us to a better place. We'll be right back.
The BioCentury Show is brought to you by
This September in Nashville, BioCentury launches Grand Rounds, a new interdisciplinary R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia. Join BioCentury and a rich roster of innovators and key thought leaders to identify leading-edge discoveries and discuss urgent challenges that must be solved to translate these innovations into product development and medical practice. Meet academic innovators, physician scientists, early-stage investors, and biopharma R&D leaders for 2 days of networking, partnering, and debate. Register at biocenturygrandrounds.com.
I'm Steve Usdin. I'm back with John O'Brien, President and CEO of the National Pharmaceutical Council. John, during the Trump administration, there were a lot of ideas that were thrown around that were intended to reduce drug prices. But one of the ones that was the most persistent, and you advocated it when you were there, was an international pricing index for Medicare Part D drugs, Part B drugs. And more broadly, the President Trump advocated the idea of, I think, what did he call it? America, most favored nation pricing for drugs, basically saying that Americans shouldn't pay more, they should pay less than what people in other countries pay for the same drugs. What do you think about it now? And what do you think, again, might happen with that kind of policy?
Yeah, again, it's something that people are talking about, and I certainly understand the temptation to look outside the United States for answers, but I think there are some important points in that policy that are often overlooked. You know, when I think about, as a percentage, what we spend in the United States on prescription drugs versus overall healthcare spending, and then compare that to other economically similar countries, we're actually on the lower end of the curve. And at the same time, we're the world leader in research and development, and we have a complex ecosystem of investors and payers with big costs and risks of bringing a molecule from the lab to the patient. And most of that risk, as our research in JAMA Health Forum pointed out, is borne by the drug developers themselves. So here we are in a golden age of biopharmaceutical innovation. The FDA approved 55 novel drugs last year, the second highest total in over 30 years. And patients in the US typically have earlier access to those newer products than patients in other countries. So I understand the temptation, I understand the talking points, and at the same time feel that central planning and price regulation doesn't lead to innovation, and adopting the practices of international systems that limit patient access isn't the answer.
So what is, I mean, one of the things that it seems to me that you're kind of hinting at is an idea of kind of like piercing the net to gross bubble, of making the pricing that patients are aware of and that employers and healthcare plans pay closer to the net price that that the pharmaceutical companies actually get. That would slash prices in half, wouldn't it?
At least, right? And the reason for the pause is because the numbers that we associated with net and what a net discount actually is have gotten so big over the years, right? So we're not just talking about the, used to be on average 30%, now it's probably closer to 50% rebate that manufacturers are providing to commercial health plans on branded medicines that are, preferred on formulary. You've got to add on top of that the discounts that are being offered to the Medicaid program, right? Which starts at 20-some% and then has an inflation penalty and then ultimately includes best price. But now you've got the 340B program, which used to be a very small program intended for a small number of safety net hospitals getting access to those discounts on an outpatient basis. I think 1/5 of all branded prescriptions are now somehow going through a 340B discount. So the amount of money that we talk about on a gross sales basis versus the net that's actually returning to the manufacturer of the medicine is just getting wider and wider and wider. And if you combine that pressure with the Inflation Reduction Act coming in and cutting off the back half of your peak sales curve, I think it puts a lot of pressure on manufacturer forecasts and really changes the way that assets are valued or development decisions have to be made.
So it's not quite as simple as saying, well, okay, 50% or whatever the number is going out of the getting sucked out of the farm industry and going into some fat cat's pockets, because that money's sloshed around, right? It's used to reduce premiums. It's used to subsidize hospitals. It's used for a lot of purposes, things that I think some of them, many of them that people would think are social goods. How do you change things around? How could you change things around so that those things that people think are actually social goods that are getting funded kind of out of the money that's coming out of the pharmaceutical industry still happen, right? So we don't create one crisis by solving another problem.
Well, I think there's a few different ways to look at that, right? Like let's first acknowledge that what we're referring to in many cases as a drugs price or drug spending is actually going somewhere else, and have an honest conversation about where that money is going. I think that's step one. Step two is figuring out, is the pharmaceutical industry the right entity to be cross-subsidizing all these other healthcare goods and services? And if so, who and how, right? I believe in the original intent of the 340B program. But if my doctor in Gaithersburg writes me a prescription and I go to the CVS pharmacy and fill it, and I pay $600-700 for that prescription because I'm still in my drug deductible, and I walk out of the pharmacy and some computer realizes, hey, wait a minute, John's a 340B patient because his doctor is practicing in an outpatient facility that is owned or affiliated with what we would refer to as a safety net hospital because of the way that the definition has become less relevant over time. Nobody chases me down and says, John, you overpaid for your prescription. You're going to acquire this medicine for pennies. What they do is they divvy that money up between the contract pharmacy that filled it, which may be owned by a health plan, which uses that to offer rates that they use to compete against somebody else. They also give the money to the vendor who's helping them figure out like who's 340B and who's not 340B. And then they may still try to ding the manufacturer for a rebate because they also swiped my insurance card during that transaction. So if we're talking about money that's going to help low-income or uninsured Americans access prescription drugs on a sliding scale, like that's a really good program. But if it's going towards the kind of profiteering that's leading to growth in outpatient acquisitions and even private equity deals on how to convert more prescriptions to 340B, I don't think that's what the law was intended to do.
Yeah, so the numbers I've seen suggest that it's about $50 billion a year that's going to 340B discounts. Maybe it's a little bit more, maybe it's a little bit less. And basically none of that goes to the patients who need those drugs, right? It's going, in the best case, it's going to the hospitals or the healthcare systems that provide them. And in the worst case, like you say, it's going to these other kind of nebulous parties. Do you think that there's any, do you think it's possible to even shed some light to have transparency around what really happens with the 340B money? And two, do you think that there's any prospect actually for changing it, especially given all the parties who have economic interest in keeping things the way that they are now or even expanding it?
I would love to see more transparency into the program so we can have a more honest conversation about where the money is actually going. It is also a very thorny political problem, right? Because look, there are some hospitals that are doing the Lord's work with this money, and those that have opened their books and said like, hey, we wouldn't be able to operate this low-income pediatric HIV medication therapy management program. So it's hard to paint everything with a broad brush. But at the same time, we know that there are institutions that are using this money for capital expenditures and other things that aren't related to the care that these patients are receiving. And there's a lot of other research out there that shows that the hospitals that are benefiting most from this program may be actually providing the least amount of these kinds of services to patients.
Shifting gears to another area where there's a real obvious relationship between economics and biomedical innovation, it's cell and gene therapies. Even the harshest critics of the biopharmaceutical industry concede that these therapies are really expensive to develop, they're expensive to manufacture, but they can be transformative for people's lives. The recent gene therapy and CRISPR therapies for sickle cell is a very obvious example. What are your thoughts about what should be done to ensure that there's accessibility, that all the people that need to get access to these kinds of drugs in the United States can?
Yeah, this is an issue that's going to require a lot of intellectual horsepower from all sides of the ecosystem, because first, we have to acknowledge that these are truly transformative therapies, and we can't pay for them with the same system that was built to pay for blood pressure drugs and cholesterol medicine for tens of millions of patients. These are medicines that are transformative for small populations. And yet they're also incredibly valuable. When you look at some of these medicines that have launched with a cost effectiveness analysis or a value story, you find value to the healthcare system, societal value, far and above the prices that they're often charging for. At the same time, if you are a small to mid-size insurer or employer, and you have an employee who needs one of these therapies, it has the potential to be really challenging to the risk pool. I think the way that some plans are dealing with it now is dropping coverage for that person, or pursuing alternative funding programs or patient assistance programs or some other way to sort of get it out of their benefit. And at the same time, if we think long term, right, like the value story tells us we should be thinking about, we're going to be reducing long-term healthcare costs that somebody else would have had to pay during this patient's lifetime. So
isn't that what reinsurance was invented for? I mean, shouldn't there be like mandatory reinsurance pools that everybody has to participate in if you're talking about something that's extremely expensive but also uncommon?
I think there's two ways to think about reinsurance, right? One is the reinsurance programs, the way that it's working now, which may work in year one, but the following year may want to make changes to the benefit design in order to offer reinsurance. And when you start talking about national pooling, we've done a fair amount of research around what the right ways to approach that could be. And I think that's an area that's ripe for further study, including whether or not that's required, whether or not the government participates in that program, whether the government is the ultimate downstream, risk holder. So again, I don't have any good answers here, and this is something that we want to be an important part of continuing to think about.
So long term, let's kind of try to end up on something that's optimistic. Where do you see things going with the research that you're doing? With you've got your ear to the ground on a lot of policymakers around Washington. What are some of the things that you think might happen in the coming year, 2 years, 3 years that would move the ball forward on resolving these kind of coupled issues of pricing and access?
Again, when I speak with our members who are the top biopharmaceutical companies that serve patients here in the US and around the world, I really want to get to a place where we can appropriately value medicines, not the kind of value that's based on bad math to try to drive prices down, but a more holistic view of this is what the payer, this is what society are getting in terms of cost avoidance, as well as employers are benefiting from productivity, families are benefiting from reduced caregiver burden, and begin to focus on what is the best way to think about that, as opposed to seeing medicines as an arbitrage opportunity to pay for other healthcare goods and services. I'd also like to help more people understand this is the ecosystem that we live in. This is what it takes to bring a medicine forward. And if you start putting too many cuts into this industry, eventually you have the potential to hit an artery that's just going to bring this innovation to a halt.
And one of the problems, I think, is that people in general and our political system is not very good at understanding things that didn't happen that could have happened, right? So sort of what you're talking about is that if there are too many policies that you think are adverse for innovation, then innovation will come to a stop or will be slowed, which basically means things that could have happened won't happen. How do you bring that into people's consciousness? How do you bring that into policymakers' consciousness?
Yeah, that's something we're thinking a lot about here, and our sum total of research is really intended to be able to explain that. If you go back to the passage of the MMA, we saw a response to those incentives that led to more primary care medicines for people in the Medicare program. And if we mess too much with those incentives, we're sending a signal to the community that we no longer value medicines for the Medicare population, and you should be putting your investment dollars into narrower indications earlier in someone's life cycle that may be more Medicaid or commercially covered. So I think it's really important for everyone to understand that all of these things are connected, and that if we destroy these incentives in one place, we're probably not going to see the innovation that we want to see.
Well, great. Well, thanks. We've run over time already. Thanks a lot, John, for a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me. This is fun.
Brought to you by BioCentury Grand Rounds. Join BioCentury and Insights partner McKinsey & Company this September in Nashville for an R&D forum at the interface of industry and academia.
Kendall Square Orchestra provides the music for the BioCentury show. The group connects science and technology professionals and other members of the greater Boston community to collaborate, innovate, and inspire through music while supporting causes related to healthcare and education.